In the autumn of 1894, the Methodist Episcopal Church South maintained a network of circuit riders whose job was to serve the mountain communities of western North Carolina that were too small, too remote, or too poor to support a resident minister. These men, there were 11 of them, assigned to the Western District that year, rode routes that covered hundreds of miles of mountain road, stopping at churches and schoolhouses and farmhouses to deliver services that some of their congregations received only 3 or 4 times annually. It was not considered desirable work. The roads were bad, and the weather was worse, and the pay reflected neither the difficulty of the job nor the importance the denomination placed on bringing religious life to communities that might otherwise go without it. The men who took circuit rider positions in the mountain districts were generally one of 3 kinds: young men who had not yet established a settled congregation and were building experience, older men whose settled congregations had dissolved for reasons that did not necessarily reflect well on anyone involved, and a third category that the denominational records do not name but that the people who assigned the routes understood implicitly: men who were given the mountain circuits because something in their character or history made them better suited to solitude and difficulty than to the ordinary requirements of parish life. Elias Vance was 41 years old in 1894. He had been a circuit rider in the Western District for 7 years. He had been a settled minister before that, in a congregation outside Asheville for 6 years. He had left that congregation. The records of his departure are brief and carefully worded, in the way that brief, carefully worded records generally indicate that more happened than is being said. In 1887, and had taken the circuit assignment in what the denominational correspondence characterized as a voluntary transfer. He was, by the accounts that survive, a serious man, not a cold man. People who knew him spoke of a warmth in him that was genuine rather than performed, the warmth of someone who actually believed what he preached, rather than someone who had learned to project belief for professional purposes. But serious. He took the work seriously. He took the people on his circuit seriously. He kept meticulous records of every service he conducted, every household he visited, every baptism and marriage and burial he performed on the road. His circuit journals, which he submitted quarterly to the district office in Asheville, are detailed documents. The details not of a man satisfying an administrative requirement, but of a man who understood that the lives of people in isolated mountain communities were as fully human as the lives of anyone anywhere, and that those lives deserved to be recorded with care. He had been to Black Fork Ridge before. The ridge was on his circuit, had been on the circuit since before his assignment to it, though the records from the years prior to his tenure are less detailed and do not make clear how regularly it had been served. The community at Black Fork Ridge was small. He estimated in his circuit journal between 30 and 40 residents in the immediate area, though the population of the surrounding hollows that might reasonably be considered part of the community could have brought the number higher. They were farming families primarily, with some timber work, some small-scale mining in the upper reaches of the ridge. They attended services when he came. The church at Black Fork Ridge had been built, by the best estimate the community could provide, when he asked, sometime in the 1850s. The builder and the circumstances of the construction were not remembered with any clarity. It had been built before the living memory of most current residents, before the war, in a period that felt historically distant, to a community whose recent decades had been defined by the conflict and its aftermath. It was a simple structure: timber frame, single room, a raised platform at the front that served as a pulpit, 2 rows of pews on each side of the central aisle, The pews were well made, better made in fact, than the building itself, which suggested they had either been brought in from somewhere else or constructed by someone with more skill than had built the church around them. The church had no windows. Vance had noted this the first time he saw it, in 1887, the year he took the circuit. He had asked about it. The community members he asked gave varying answers. Some said the original builder had intended windows and had never gotten to them. Some said the windows had been removed after the war for reasons no one could clearly articulate. Some said the church had never had windows, had been built without them from the start, for reasons that no one currently knew. The last explanation seemed to Vance the most likely, based on the construction. There were no framed openings in the walls that might have held windows, no evidence of boarding over or filling in. The walls were solid timber, from foundation to roofline, without interruption. He had also noted, on that first visit in 1887, that the church had no bell. No bell tower, no bell hook above the door, no evidence that a bell had ever been attached to the building. Mountain churches without bells were not unheard of. They were a feature of communities too poor to acquire one, or too small to need one. But the absence of a bell meant that the call to services had to be made by word of mouth. And Vance had always wondered, on the Black Fork Ridge circuit, how the congregation knew he was coming. He always arrived to find people already there. Not arriving. Already there, already seated, already waiting. He had asked about this too, and had received explanations that he recorded without fully crediting. Someone had seen him on the road below. Someone had been watching for him from the ridge. The sound of a horse on the lower trail carried up in ways that let people know well in advance. These explanations were each plausible in isolation. Together, they produced an impression of a community that was more organized and more coordinated in its attention to his arrivals than any other community on his circuit. He had made peace with this and moved on, because circuit riders who interrogated the habits of their congregations too closely generally found that their circuits became shorter. He arrived at Black Fork Ridge on a Sunday morning in October of 1894. He wrote about what he found in two places. The first was his circuit journal, submitted, in the normal course of his quarterly reports, to the district office in Asheville in January of 1895. The journal entry for October 14th, 1894, the day of his Black Fork Ridge visit, is 9 words long. He wrote, "Services at Black Fork Ridge. Did not complete." 9 words. In a journal where his entries ran, on average, to several hundred words per service, where he recorded the names of congregants, the text of his sermon, the weather, the condition of the road, the state of the community's morale and material circumstances. 9 words. The second place he wrote about that Sunday was in a letter he submitted to the Methodist Conference in Charlotte, the regional denominational authority above the district office. He submitted this letter in November of 1894, approximately 6 weeks after the visit. The letter was, by his account and subsequent correspondence, detailed. He had written it over several days, with care, in the manner of a man trying to find language, adequate to a thing that resisted adequate language. The letter was returned to him, unopened, in December of 1894. On the envelope, in handwriting he did not recognize, a single word had been written: forget. He did not forget. He tried, in the years that followed, to find other channels, other people, other institutions, other frameworks, through which to report what he had seen in the church at Black Fork Ridge on a Sunday morning in October of 1894. None of those attempts produced any official response. Some of them produced responses that were not official, but that were clear enough in their meaning. This is not something you should pursue. He pursued it anyway, quietly, for the remaining 11 years of his life. He died in 1905 at the age of 52, of causes his death record described as heart failure, and that people who knew him in his final years described differently, as the failure of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. What he had been carrying was what he had found in that church, and what he had found in that church begins not with what was in it, but with what was on the doors. Vance arrived at Black Fork Ridge on horseback at approximately 9 in the morning. The ride up from the valley had taken longer than usual. The October weather had turned cold overnight, and there had been ice on the higher sections of the trail, which required careful footing and reduced the pace to something that tested his patience. He was running late by his own estimate, which meant the congregation would have been waiting for him for at least 20 minutes by the time he reached the church. He had been late to Black Fork Ridge before, and the congregation had always waited. He did not consider this unusual. Mountain communities were accustomed to adjusting their schedules to the realities of mountain roads, and a congregation that came out on a cold Sunday morning to an unheated church to wait for a minister they saw 3 or 4 times a year was a congregation whose patience had been demonstrated. He tied his horse at the post beside the church and approached the door. The door was closed. He could see through the gap between the door and its frame that the interior was darker than the outside, which was to be expected given the absence of windows in a church that depended entirely on the open door for its light. But the gap was not giving him the sound that a church full of 34 people waiting in cold silence would give him. The small sounds of breath and shifting weight, and the particular muffled quality of air in an enclosed space occupied by human bodies. He opened the door. What he found was described in the fragments of correspondence and notes that survived him, in 4 separate accounts, written at 4 different times in the years after 1894. The accounts are consistent with each other in their essential details and consistent in their inconsistencies. The places where the language breaks down are the same places in all 4 accounts, the same hesitations around the same moments. This consistency across accounts written years apart suggests that Vance was describing something he had seen clearly and remembered exactly, rather than something that had become distorted or amplified by time. The church was full. 34 people, he estimated, seated in the pews. He recognized most of them. They were the regular Black Fork Ridge congregation, the families he had been serving for 7 years on this circuit. He saw the Brewer family in their usual pew on the left side, 3rd row. He saw old Thomas Cutshaw, who was 91 years old, and who had been coming to services at this church since before the war, in his seat near the front. He saw the younger families, the children, the arrangement of familiar faces that constitutes the specific texture of a community you have served long enough to know. They were seated with their hands folded in their laps, looking forward at the empty pulpit. They did not turn when the door opened. He stood in the doorway for a moment, waiting for the natural response to a door opening. The turn of heads, the shift of attention, the small adjustments that people make when the person they have been waiting for arrives. None of this happened. 34 people sat in the pews with their hands folded and their eyes forward, as still as the carved figures on the pews themselves. He said good morning. No one responded. He walked down the aisle toward the pulpit, looking at the faces as he passed. He wrote, in his most detailed account of this moment. The faces were those of people I knew. I want to be precise about this. They were not unfamiliar, not disguised, not wrong in any obvious way. They were the faces of the Brewer family, and old Thomas Cutshaw, and the rest. The faces I had known for 7 years on this circuit. But there was something absent from them that I am not able to name more precisely than this. They looked like faces that had been recently vacated, the way a room looks when someone has just left it. Everything in its place but the particular quality that presence gives a space. Gone. He reached the pulpit. He turned to face the congregation. 34 people looked back at him. Their eyes were open and oriented toward him, and he could not determine whether they were seeing him. He began the service. He said afterward, in a letter to an old seminary friend, the most candid account he gave to anyone directly, that he began the service because he did not know what else to do. He had come to deliver a service, and there was a congregation in front of him. And the alternative to proceeding was to acknowledge that what was in the pews was not a congregation in the sense that would allow him to proceed, and this acknowledgement was one he was not yet ready to make. So he opened his Bible and found his text and began to speak. He spoke for approximately 10 minutes. At no point during those 10 minutes did any person in the pews move. At no point did any person cough, or shift their weight, or blink that he could detect, or make any of the small, involuntary motions that people make during the 10 minutes of a sermon. 34 people sat in absolute stillness and looked at him, and he spoke to them, and the sound of his own voice in that dark, windowless room was, he wrote, the most frightening sound he had ever heard. Not because it was loud, because it was the only sound. At some point, in the 10th minute, he stopped speaking. He closed his Bible. He looked at the congregation for what he estimated was several minutes. Nothing changed. Nothing moved. The cold air of the church. It was October. There was no fire, and the lack of windows meant the cold had settled in the building thoroughly. Was completely still. He could not see the breath of 34 people in that cold air. He turned and walked back up the aisle toward the door. He had his hand on the door when he noticed the handles. The door had a handle on the outside. He had used it to open the door when he arrived. The handle was a standard iron pull, fixed to the door with 2 bolts, worn smooth with use. The inside of the door had no handle. He stood with his hand pressed flat against the door's interior surface and felt the wood, and felt the absence of any protrusion, any fitting, any mechanism by which a person standing inside the church could open the door from within. The hinges were on the outside of the frame. The door opened outward. A person inside the church, without a handle, would need to press or push the door open, and a door that opened outward could not be pressed or pushed open from the inside. He looked at the door for a long time. Then he pushed against it, and it opened. It was not locked. It was simply a door with no inside handle, and it opened to his pressure without difficulty. And he walked out into the cold October morning, and stood in the churchyard with his hands at his sides, and looked at the trees on the ridge above him. He did not look back at the church. He untied his horse. He rode down the mountain. He did not stop until he reached the valley road, and then he stopped and sat on his horse for some time at the edge of the road with the mountains above him, and tried to find the correct framework for what he had just experienced. He did not find it that day. He spent the remaining 11 years of his life looking for it. He never quite found it, but he came closer than most. There were things he had not yet noticed when he left the church that morning. Things he understood only gradually, in the days and weeks that followed, as he assembled what he had seen into a sequence he could examine. The first was the cold. He had noted the cold in the church, the absence of a fire, the settled cold of a building without windows that has been closed in October. This was normal. He had conducted services in unheated mountain churches before, and knew what cold churches felt like in autumn. What he had not immediately registered was that 34 people in an enclosed space, even a cold enclosed space, produce heat. Human bodies produce heat. A congregation of 34 people sitting in an unheated church in October would, over the 20 or so minutes they had presumably been waiting for him, have begun to warm the air around them to a detectable degree. The breath of 34 people on a cold morning would have been visible, misting in the cold air, condensing. He had not seen breath. He had felt no warmth in the air the 34 bodies would have produced. He had, without registering it at the time, been in an enclosed space with 34 people and experienced the air temperature of an enclosed space with no people in it at all. The second thing came to him a week after the visit, when he was on another part of his circuit and found himself thinking about Thomas Cutshaw. Thomas Cutshaw was 91 years old. He had been coming to services at the Black Fork Ridge Church since before the war. Vance had known him for 7 years on the circuit, had served communion to him, had sat with him on his porch in the summers, and listened to him talk about the ridge and its history, had conducted the burial service for Cutshaw's wife 4 years before. Thomas Cutshaw had died in March of 1894. Vance had conducted the burial service himself. He had written it in his circuit journal, March 12, 1894. Thomas Cutshaw, age 90. Burial at Black Fork Ridge Cemetery. Service attended by approximately 15 community members. Thomas Cutshaw had been dead for 7 months when Vance saw him in the front pew of the Black Fork Ridge Church in October of 1894. Vance wrote in the account he gave his seminary friend, "When I understood this, I went back through my circuit journals. I went back through every service I had conducted at Black Fork Ridge in the 7 years of my assignment. I found 3 others, people I had recorded as dead, as buried, as mourned, as gone, who had been in those pews on that October morning. One of them had died in 1889, one in 1891, one in the summer of 1894. He wrote, I then did something that I think was the most frightening thing I have ever done, more frightening than the morning itself. I tried to remember the other faces, the ones I had recognized without having paused on them, the way you recognize the faces of people you know well without actively examining them. I tried to look at those faces in memory and count back against my circuit journals. He wrote, I stopped when I had found 7. He wrote, I stopped because I realized I was not going to find a limit, and the absence of a limit was a thing I was not equipped to accommodate. The history of the church at Black Fork Ridge, as far as it can be reconstructed from sources that are not Elias Vance's own accounts, is a history of absences. There is no record of its construction in the county building records of the period, which is not unusual. Informal construction in mountain communities rarely involve documentation. There is no record of it in the denominational archives of any Methodist organization prior to 1887, the year Vance took the circuit. Before 1887, the circuit records show Black Fork Ridge listed as a stop, but no minister's account of a service there survives from before Vance's tenure. and it is unclear whether this is because the records were lost, never filed, or never written. The county deed records show the land on which the church stands as belonging, in the 1850s, to a man named Harmon Pohl. Harmon Pohl does not appear in any other county record. He is not in the census of 1850 or 1860. He is not in the county tax records. He is not in the military rolls of the war period. He simply appears in a deed record as the owner of a parcel of mountain land, and then disappears from all subsequent documentation. The church appears on a county survey map from 1868, the earliest cartographic record in which it is marked, labeled only as Meeting House, Black Fork. The surveyor who produced the map made no annotation about the building beyond its position and its designation. A local historian named Arthur Dole, who researched the communities of western North Carolina in the 1930s as part of a Works Progress Administration documentation project, visited Black Fork Ridge in 1936 and wrote a brief account of the church and the Ridge community. His account, preserved in the state archives, describes the church as it existed at that time: standing, structurally sound, apparently maintained, though he could find no evidence of an active congregation. The pews, he noted, were clean. He described them as remarkably clean for a structure that showed no signs of regular occupancy. He asked local people about the church. He received what he described as a consistent non-answer, a pattern of deflection and redirection that he recognized as the way communities handle questions about things they have decided not to discuss with outsiders. He was told the church was old. He was told it had not been used since he couldn't say exactly when. He was told there was nothing particular to know about it. He noted in his account, one elderly woman, when I pressed her, said something I have been thinking about since. She said, "The church is not empty. It never has been. We just don't go there anymore." I asked her when people had stopped going. She said, "When we understood what it had become." I asked her what it had become. She said, "A keeping place." I asked what that meant. She looked at me for a moment, and then said she was tired and went inside. Dole wrote, "I do not know what she meant, but the phrase has stayed with me, a keeping place. It suggests not absence, but a specific kind of presence, something kept rather than lost." He did not pursue the matter further in his WPA work. His account of Black Fork Ridge was included in a collection of Western North Carolina community histories that was published in limited edition in 1941 and is now held, in its few surviving copies, by several state university libraries. Vance, in the 11 years between his October 1894 visit and his death in 1905, pursued the history of the church with a thoroughness that went well beyond what a circuit minister could professionally justify, and that he conducted, accordingly, in private. He was looking for precedent, for evidence that what he had witnessed had happened before, that there was an existing framework within which it could be understood. He found fragments. He found in the Methodist denominational archives in Asheville a reference, a single line in an 1876 circuit report, to a service at Black Fork Ridge that had been left incomplete due to circumstances the presiding minister declined to specify. The minister who filed that report was a man named Corbett, who had died in 1879. There was no further record of the circumstances or any inquiry into them. He found in the county sheriff's records from the 1860s a report of a welfare check conducted at Black Fork Ridge in November of 1863. During the war, when county law enforcement was minimal and welfare checks were rare. The check had been requested by a family in the valley who had not received any communication from their relatives on the ridge for an unusually long period. The deputy who conducted the check filed a report that noted, "Community present and in apparent health. Church building observed on ridge. No other observations of note." The brevity of the report, in a period when deputies wrote brief reports about everything, was not itself remarkable. What Vance found remarkable was the date, November 1863. The church, by this account, was already on the ridge during the war years, already established enough to be described as a landmark. He found, in the private papers of a retired Methodist bishop he corresponded with in the early 1900s, a reference to something the bishop called the matter of the ridge churches. Churches in remote mountain areas that had, at various points in the denomination's history, been quietly removed from active circuit assignments without formal explanation. The bishop was vague about specifics and was clearly uncomfortable discussing the subject in any detail. But he confirmed in a letter to Vance that is carefully worded but unmistakable in its implication that Black Fork Ridge was not the only such case. He wrote, "There have been other places over the years where ministers have encountered congregations that the denomination found it simpler to leave unserved. I am not at liberty to be more specific. I will say only that what you describe from Black Fork Ridge is not, in my understanding of these matters, without precedent, and that the precedents, where they exist, have universally been handled, as you describe your own report was handled, with a return unopened and a single instruction." Vance wrote back, asking what the instruction had been in the other cases. The bishop did not reply. The bishop died in 1903, 2 years before Vance. His private papers were donated to the denominational archive in Charlotte. A researcher who attempted to access them in the 1980s was told they were restricted. The restriction has not been lifted. There was one more thing that Vance found, or rather, one more thing that found him. It came in the form of a visitor in the spring of 1898, 4 years after his Black Fork Ridge visit. The visitor was a woman named Nora Folk, who had grown up in a community 3 ridges east of Black Fork. She was in her 70s, which placed her birth in the 1820s, old enough to have knowledge of the ridge and its church from before the war. She had come to find Vance specifically, having heard from someone that he had been asking questions about the Black Fork Ridge Church. She did not explain how she had heard this or from whom. She sat with him for 2 hours in the parlor of the boarding house, where he was staying during a break in his circuit. She told him what she knew. She said, "The church was there before I was born. My mother remembered it being there when she was a girl, which puts it back to at least the first decade of the century, probably earlier. People went to it for a long time. Regular services, a regular congregation, all the ordinary things a church is for." She said, "And then something happened, and people stopped going. Not all at once. Gradually, the way you stop going somewhere when you understand that going there has become a different thing than it used to be." Vance asked what had changed. She said, "The people who went kept going. My mother said this in a way that I did not understand as a child and understand now only partially. The people who went to that church kept going. They didn't leave." She said, "Some of those people died in the ordinary way, in the years after whatever happened. They got sick, they had accidents, they died of old age. They were buried in the Ridge Cemetery like everyone else." She said, "But some of them," my mother said, "were still there. Still in the church." She said my mother would not go near the building, and would not let her children go near it, and would never explain precisely why, except to say that there were people in it who should not be there, who had no right to still be there, who were there because the church had taken them, and the church did not give back what it took. Vance asked her what she meant by the church taking people. She thought about this for a while. Then she said, "I think it means the church is not what a church is. I think it looks like a church, and it is in the shape of a church, and it has pews and a pulpit and the form of everything a church should be. But it is not a church. It is something else that has made itself into the shape of a church because the shape of a church brings people in." She said, "My mother used a word for it that is not an English word. It is an older word from the language the people here spoke before English. The word means a place that calls and keeps." She said, "It calls in the shape of whatever the people coming to it expect to find, and it keeps them in whatever state they arrive in, preserves them, maintains them." She said, "The people in those pews are not dead, by my mother's understanding. They are not alive either. They are kept." Vance asked, "Kept for what purpose?" She said, "She never knew." She said, "I do not know. I think maybe the purpose is the keeping itself. Some things keep because keeping is what they do, not because they have a use for what they keep." She stood up to leave. At the door she turned back and said something Vance recorded in 3 different accounts, word for word, exactly. She said, "You should not go back there. The fact that you came out does not mean you are safe. It means it let you out, because it wanted you to tell people, because the telling brings more people, because that is how it calls." She left. He did not see her again. He tried to find her, in subsequent years, through the community she had described as her origin. No one in that community knew a woman named Nora Falk. The name did not appear in any county record he could locate. He wrote in his notes about that conversation, "I cannot account for her. I cannot account for where she came from, or how she knew to find me, or why she had the knowledge she had. I can account for the effect of what she said, which was to make everything I had been trying to explain to myself for 4 years into a single coherent thing. I had been looking for a framework. She gave me one. I am not certain the framework is correct. I am certain it is the closest thing to correct I am going to find." He wrote, "She said it lets people out because it wants them to tell others, because the telling brings more people in." He wrote, "I have spent 4 years trying to tell people. I have spent 4 years finding every channel I could think of to report what I saw in that church. None of those attempts have succeeded. The report I sent to Charlotte was returned unopened. The bishop would not give me specifics. The denominational archive is closed. Every attempt to tell has been stopped." He wrote, "I am writing this in my journal. The journal will be submitted to the district office with my quarterly report. It will be read or not read and filed." He wrote, "I am aware that this is telling. I am aware of what she said telling leads to." He wrote, "I do not know what else to do." Elias Vance submitted his circuit journals to the district office in Asheville through the end of his life. After his death in 1905, his personal papers, the notes and correspondence and private accounts that went beyond his official journals, were given by his surviving sister to a seminary in Virginia that had been his alma mater. The seminary held them for 30 years without cataloging them, as institutions often hold things they have received without quite knowing what to do with. In 1935, a seminary librarian cataloging a backlog of uncatalogued donations opened the box of Vance's papers and read enough of them to understand that they were significant in a way that his training had not prepared him for. He cataloged them accurately. The accession record he created is a competent professional document that describes the paper's content in neutral archival language. He did not write about them in any other format. He did, however, make a notation in the accession record that is unusual for a professional catalog entry. He wrote at the bottom of the record, in handwriting that is noticeably different from the formal cataloging script used for the rest of the entry. These papers should be read carefully and in full before any portion is shared with researchers. Some of what is described in them is not something that should be read without preparation. This notation was read over the following decades by several researchers who visited the seminary archive. Most of them noted it and proceeded with their research without thinking about it further. One of them, a historian of American religious communities named Lena Marsh, no relation to the Edward Marsh of the Tennessee expedition, took it seriously. She spent 3 weeks with Vance's papers in 1962. She read everything. She took detailed notes. When she left the seminary, she drove directly to western North Carolina and spent 2 days trying to find Black Fork Ridge. She found it. The road up to the ridge was passable by car as far as a certain point and then required walking. She walked for 45 minutes and came out onto the ridge and found the church. It was standing. This was, by 1962, 68 years after Vance's visit. The church had been standing for at least 100 years by that point, possibly significantly longer. The timber framing had weathered, but was structurally intact. The roof had been repaired at some point. The repair work was visible. Newer timber replacing older, but the repair had been done carefully, and the building was sound. The exterior showed the normal signs of a building that has been maintained over a long period without being actively used. Clean, weathered to a consistent gray, without the particular decay of abandoned structures that have been left entirely to the elements. The door was closed. Marsh stood in front of the church for some time. She had driven 1,200 miles from the seminary in Virginia. She had read every word Vance had written about this building. She had come here specifically and deliberately, and with the full knowledge of what Vance had described finding when he opened the door. She opened the door. She wrote about what she found in a journal that she kept throughout her research trips. The journal was not published during her lifetime. It was included in the paper she donated to a university library in 1998, a year before her death. It was not specifically marked as sensitive or restricted. A graduate student found it in 2004 while researching an unrelated topic and recognized what it was. What Marsh wrote in her journal about the interior of the church at Black Fork Ridge in 1962 is as follows. She wrote, "The pews are clean. This is the first thing. The pews are made from a wood I cannot identify with certainty. Not pine, not oak, not the standard timber of mountain church construction. The grain is different. The color is different, darker than it should be, with a quality of depth to the surface that I cannot account for in practical terms. They look like they have been recently cleaned. They are not dusty." She wrote, "The church is empty. I want to be clear about this. There is no one in the pews. There is no one in the building. I walked the full length of the interior, and there is no person, no body, no physical presence of any kind beyond the structure itself and its contents. The pews, the pulpit platform, the bare walls, nothing else." She wrote, "The church is not empty in the other sense. I want to be clear about this too, while acknowledging that I am not sure I have the language for it. The building has a quality of occupancy, a quality of a space that is in use, that is maintained, that has a purpose being actively served, that is at direct odds with the physical absence of any occupant. I have been in many old buildings. I know the feeling of abandonment, of a space that has been vacated and left. This is not that feeling. This is the feeling of a room that someone has just stepped out of and will shortly return to. She wrote, "I didn't stay long, not because I was frightened, or not only because I was frightened, but because the quality of the space seemed to actively discourage extended presence. Not through any visible mechanism, through something more like a pressure, atmospheric and consistent, that communicated without words that this was not a place intended for the kind of occupancy I was attempting." She wrote, "The door, I noted when I left, has no handle on the inside." She wrote, "I walked back down the ridge and drove 200 miles east before I stopped for the night. I do not know why I drove that far. It seemed correct to put distance between myself and the ridge. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do." She wrote, "I am going to try to publish something about Vance's papers and what they describe. I am going to try to do this through the normal academic channels. I expect the effort will fail in a way that I cannot predict in advance but will recognize when it happens." The effort did fail. She submitted a paper to 3 academic journals. 2 declined without explanation beyond the standard rejection language. The 3rd requested significant revisions that would have removed the specific content of Vance's accounts, the actual description of what he had seen, and replaced it with what the editor called a more contextualized treatment of 19th century religious experience. She declined to make the revisions and withdrew the paper. She wrote one more thing about Black Fork Ridge in a letter to a colleague in 1987, 25 years after her visit. She wrote, "I have thought about that church for 25 years. Not obsessively, not to the exclusion of my other work, but consistently. It surfaces regularly, the way certain memories do when they have not been fully processed. I have come to a position on it that I would not have been capable of when I was younger, and more invested in the distinction between what can be explained and what cannot." She wrote, "The distinction, in this case, does not serve. There are things that happened at Black Fork Ridge that are still happening at Black Fork Ridge, if Vance's account and my own visit tell us anything, that do not belong in either category. They are not explainable in the terms I was trained to use, but they are also not supernatural in the sense that distinguishes them from the real. They are real. They are simply real in a way that falls outside the frameworks I have available." She wrote, "The church is still there. The pews are still clean. The door still has no handle on the inside. And whatever is in that building, whatever maintains it, whatever fills it with the quality of occupancy without providing any occupant, has been there for longer than anyone currently living can account for. It was there before Vance. It was there before the denomination put the church on its circuit. It was there before the church was built, in all probability, and the church was built around it, or on top of it, or in its service, and the church is the shape it takes in the world, the form it uses to bring people to it." She wrote, "Nora Folk, whoever she was, said it most clearly, a place that calls and keeps." She wrote, "It is still calling." The church at Black Fork Ridge is still standing. This is not a metaphor. It is not a legend. It is a physical structure at a specific location in the mountains of western North Carolina that can be visited by anyone willing to walk the last section of the ridge road on foot. It was standing when Arthur Dole visited in 1936. It was standing when Lena Marsh visited in 1962. It has been standing in the accounts of the people who have visited it in the decades since, with a consistency that the laws of timber construction do not entirely explain. Timber structures in the mountains of North Carolina, left without active maintenance, have a practical lifespan, measured in decades rather than centuries. The humidity, the temperature fluctuations, the insect activity, the freeze-thaw cycles that work at joints and seams. All of these forces act on wood at a rate that makes a century of standing, without maintenance, unusual, and a century and a half essentially impossible. The Black Fork Ridge Church, if it was built in the early 19th century, as the available evidence suggests, should not be standing in the condition it stands in. The condition it stands in is the condition of a building that is being maintained. By whom and to what end is a question that no one who has visited it has been able to answer. The most recent documented visit by a researcher was conducted in 2019 by a historian from the University of North Carolina who had come across Lena Marsh's papers in the university library collection. He drove to the ridge, walked the last section of the road, and found the church. He took photographs. He measured the structure. He examined the timber framing and the condition of the joints and the roof and the foundation. And he wrote in his research notes that the building showed no evidence of deterioration that he would expect to find in a structure of its apparent age without active maintenance. He wrote, "The wood is sound in a way that is difficult to explain, given the building's age and the absence of any identified caretaker. The joints are tight. The foundation is stable. The roof shows signs of repair that appears to have been done within the last several decades. But the original framing is in condition that I would characterize as anomalously good." He did not open the door. He wrote in the notes from that visit, "I stood in front of the door for some time. I have read Vance's accounts and Marsh's journal. I know what they describe finding when they open the door. I am a historian, and I am professionally committed to primary source research and direct engagement with the evidence. I did not open the door. I could not account for this at the time, and I am still not fully able to account for it. There was nothing visible that discouraged me from opening the door. There was nothing audible. There was simply a quality of the space in front of the door that I was not willing to move into. I walked back down the ridge." He has not published his findings. When asked, he says he is still working on the contextualization. The local community around Black Fork Ridge, a small community, the ridge having lost most of its population to the valley towns over the course of the 20th century, does not discuss the church with outsiders. This is not a new position. It appears to have been the community's position for as long as anyone currently living can remember, and to have been the community's position for long before that. As Dole found in 1936 and Vance found in the 1890s, when he tried to discuss what he had seen with the community members he served on other parts of his circuit. One person spoke. She was an elderly woman. She did not give her name. The researcher who spoke to her in 2019 reported, who was working in her garden near the road when he passed on his walk up to the ridge. She asked where he was going. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The pews are never dusty." He asked what she meant. She said, "People go up and look through the door sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. Young people from the university mostly, or tourists who have read something about it. They look through the door, and they come back. and they say the pews are clean. Not dirty. The way old things get dirty. Clean. Like someone cleaned them today. He asked her whether she had ever been inside. She said, "No." She said, "My grandmother told me not to." She said her grandmother told her not to. She said, "It goes back further than that, but that is as far back as I know." He asked her what her grandmother had said about the church. She said the church is not a church. She said the people who go in don't come out the same way they went in. She said there are people in there who went in a long time ago and are still in there, and they are not what they were when they went in, and they are not what they would be if they had died, and they are something in between. That does not have a name in any language she knew. She said on Sunday mornings you can hear singing. He asked whether she had ever heard it. She picked up her trowel and turned back to her garden. He stood on the road for a moment. Then, from behind him, she said, without turning around, in a voice that was not exactly quiet, she said, "If you hear it, don't answer it." She said, "That is the one rule. That is the only rule anyone has ever had about that place that has kept anyone safe. If you hear it, do not answer it." He walked up to the ridge. He stood in front of the door. He walked back down. He did not hear singing. He did not know whether this was because there was no singing, or because October is not Sunday, or because the singing, if it exists, if it has always existed, if it has been coming from that windowless building on that ridge since before anyone now living was born, is selective in who it reaches and when. He drove east that evening, farther than he needed to drive before stopping for the night. He wrote in his notes, "I do not know why I drove so far. It seemed like the right amount of distance." Elias Vance spent 11 years trying to find the right framework for what he had seen in that church in October of 1894. He died without finding it. He died having been told by Nora Folk that the telling brings more people, and having chosen to tell anyway because he did not know what else to do. He was a minister. Telling was what he did. He had spent his adult life in the conviction that the truth, spoken, was better than the truth held privately in silence. He held this conviction to the end, even when the truth he was speaking was one that no institution would receive and no framework would accommodate. He submitted his circuit journals to the district office every quarter until his death. The entry for October 14th, 1894, is 9 words long. Every other entry he wrote in 7 years of circuit writing runs to several hundred words. The gap speaks clearly enough for anyone willing to read it. The church at Black Fork Ridge is still there. The road up the ridge is still walkable. The door still opens to outward pressure. The same door, or a door made to the same specifications, with a handle on the outside and a smooth face on the inside, and no mechanism by which a person within can let themselves out. The pews are clean. On Sunday mornings, if you stand close enough, and if it chooses to let you hear it, you can sometimes hear singing from inside the church. What is singing is not a question that anyone who has heard it has been willing to answer. What is being sung is not a question that anyone has reported being able to identify, though several people, in the fragments of accounts that survive various researchers' visits to the ridge, have described it as familiar, as the kind of music you have heard before, somewhere, in circumstances you no longer clearly remember, as the kind of music that makes you want to go toward it. Elias Vance wrote, in the last journal he submitted before his death, "I do not know what is in that church. I know that it is old. I know that it has been doing what it does for longer than the church has existed. I know that the church is the form it takes, the way certain things take the form of whatever will bring the thing they need to them. I know that 34 people were in those pews in October of 1894, and that some of them had been dead for years and were nonetheless there, maintained, kept, in the state they had arrived in. I know that the door has no handle on the inside. He wrote, I know that it let me out. He wrote, I have spent 11 years understanding that this is not the end of the story. Being let out is not the same as being free. Something that keeps people in a windowless church in the mountains of North Carolina and maintains them across decades and calls more of them in through the form of Sunday services and the sound of singing on Sunday mornings. Something that has been doing this for as long as it appears to have been doing this does not let people out because it is finished with them. He wrote, it lets them out to do what Nora Folks said, to tell, to bring more. He wrote, I am telling. He wrote, God forgive me, I do not know what else to do. He submitted the journal. The district office received it. It was filed. The church at Black Fork Ridge remained on the circuit for another 3 years, assigned to a different minister, before being quietly removed from the active circuit list in 1908 with a notation that read, Community no longer requires scheduled services. The church continued to stand. The pews continued to be clean. The singing, when it comes on Sunday mornings. It is still coming. If you hear it, do not answer it. That is the one rule. That is the only rule that has ever kept anyone safe. Do not answer it.